Hello, I am Sudipto Mondal and welcome to Reflections on What's Your Ism. Now, I've started this reflection segment to create some breathing space between episodes to hold on to an idea for a little longer before moving to the next topic. I'll try and provide footnotes, share references for further reading. Now, don't forget that What's Your Ism is available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts as well. I am designing these episodes to provide a sort of immersive listening experience, so you might want to put on your headphones or connect to a speaker. Alright, now in this episode, I'm trying to look back at the conversation I had with Dr. Raees Muhammad, who was Ravichandran Bathran when I first met him more than a decade ago. I was reporting on student politics at the time, and he was a young anti-caste student leader full of radical ideas. His organization was involved in many agitations. There were cases against him and his comrades. He had also started Dalit Camera, was a bright scholar and researcher. He'd been invited for a postdoc to a foreign university. So it was a little disorienting for me to see him sitting in front of me dressed in a black coat and tie, starting all over again as a law student. It made me think about all the Dalit, Adivasi and Muslim students I have met in my career, which, by the way, has coincided with the rise of the right wing in India. All of them have suffered great losses in these last 10-15 years. But some of them have had a sort of safety net, a more robust organization to fall back upon, friends and relatives in high places, more funds, better lawyers. Raees Muhammad's journey reminds me of the student leaders of the Rohit Vemula movement in universities across the country, the young village level leaders of the Una agitation in Gujarat, the young Muslims of the CAA NRC protests, some of whom are still in jail. It has obviously taken a heavy toll, but they have also been able to move mountains. The Rohit Vemula agitation culminated in a writ petition before the Supreme Court seeking protection against caste discrimination in higher educational institutions. It was filed by the mothers of Rohit Vemula and Payal Tadvi, who died by suicide because of institutional caste harassment. The court has hauled up the government over this issue. Now finally, around 2 months ago, in February this year, the UGC was forced to submit a draft policy for equity in higher educational institutions. The proposal is to make anti-discrimination cells, set up counseling centers and helplines, and impose penalties on institutions for non-compliance. And, of course, the Congress leadership has instructed its governments in Telangana and Karnataka to seriously once again take up the issue of drafting the Rohit Act. The day might not be far away when we see affirmative action finally in private institutions. Now, I want to come back to the interview with Raees. I want to reflect on the discussion around his conversion to Islam. I was struck by what he said about purity, pollution, and Islam. He says that when he first started visiting mosques and dargahs, he was amazed to discover that there were elaborate arrangements for bathrooms and toilets inside. He described wudu, the process of cleaning before prayers, as a sort of liberating experience. The quiet dignity with which Muslims treat toilets and bathrooms clearly struck a deep chord in Raees. It isn't difficult to see why it matters so much to him. He hails from a community that has faced the worst form of social oppression because they were involved in conservancy work. I have followed Raees's work for many years, and I have always found him to be a person who provokes people into discussions that they don't want to have, things that they are too queasy to talk about. For instance, I have often heard him say that the history of caste is the history of how this civilization deals with its own shit. In fact, in this interview, Raees quotes the rock star Slovenian scholar Slavoj Žižek on toilets. Žižek says that we could learn a lot about a civilization based on its relationship with shit and how it builds its toilets. What I'm going to do now is to read an excerpt from Žižek. I think it will help set context for what Raees was talking about. This is a section from a book by Žižek called The Plague of Fantasies. It's a little dense, so bear with me. Here goes. In a traditional German toilet, the hole into which the shit disappears after we flush it is right at the front so that the shit is first laid out for us to sniff and inspect for traces of illness. In the typical French toilet, on the contrary, the hole is at the back. That is, the shit is supposed to disappear as quickly as possible. And finally, the American Anglo-Saxon toilet presents a synthesis, a mediation between these opposites. The toilet basin is full of water so that the shit floats in it, visible, but not to be inspected. It is clear that none of these versions can be accounted for in purely utilitarian terms. Each involves a certain ideological perception of how the subject should relate to excrement. Hegel was among the first to see in the geographical triad of Germany, France, and England an expression of three different existential attitudes: reflective thoroughness, which is German, revolutionary hastiness, which is French, and utilitarian pragmatism, which is English. In political terms, this triad can be read as German conservatism, French revolutionary radicalism, and English liberalism. The point about toilets is that they enable us to not only discern this triad in the most intimate domain, but also to identify its underlying mechanism in the three different attitudes towards excremental excess: an ambiguous, contemplative fascination, a wish to get rid of it as fast as possible, a pragmatic decision to treat it as ordinary and dispose of it in an appropriate way. It is easy for academics at a round table to claim that we live in a post-ideological universe. But the moment they visit the lavatory, after the heated discussion, they are again knee-deep in ideology. Okay, so I'm not going to apologize to those who felt a little queasy about all the discussion and the focus on shit in Žižek's work, because I feel that the denial of shit is at the root of our problems as a society. In a philosophical sense, all illusion begins with the inability to deal with the reality of our own shit. In fact, if you'll allow me, I want to get into this shit a little more, like really dig my hands in. At this point, I really want to bring in the world-famous author Milan Kundera and his scatological reflections. I'm going to read a section from his most famous book, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. Now, Kundera is getting into dangerous territory in this section. He's trying to look at the seeming incompatibility between God and shit. One is the epitome of purity, and the other represents everything that we find undesirable. So here goes. Spontaneously, without ideological training, I, as a child, grasped the incompatibility of God and shit, and thus came to question the basic thesis of Christian anthropology, namely that man was created in God's image. Either or. Either man was created in God's image and has intestines, or God lacks intestines and man is not like him. The ancient Gnostics felt as I did at the age of 5. In the 2nd century, the great Gnostic master Valentinus resolved the damnable dilemma by claiming that Jesus, quote-unquote, ate and drank but did not defecate. Shit is a more onerous theological problem than is evil. Since God gave man freedom, we can, if need be, accept the idea that he is not responsible for man's crimes. The responsibility for shit, however, rests entirely with him, the creator of man. The moral of the story? Well, to borrow an idiom from Gen Z, dealing with shit is the solulu to our collective delulu. But on a serious note, the point to reflect on here is that the pursuit of the divine can sometimes rob us of our humanity. And I suppose the point Raees was trying to make is that the existence of shit raises profound questions about the relationship between the supernatural and the natural. Shit is surely an important starting point in the discussions about religion, caste, untouchability, and ritual purity in South Asia. I'll stop here. I hope I offered some provocations for you to respond to. Write to me. My email ID is sudipto@thenewsminute.com. You could also show your appreciation by paying me for my work. You can do that by subscribing to the News Minute and scanning this QR code. I'll see you in the next episode of What's Your Ism?